The courthouse was small, almost quaint, with creaky wooden floors and faded yellow walls that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. Judge Thomas Carver, known for his strict but fair demeanor, sat at the bench in his black robe, his gavel within arm's reach. The sun outside filtered through the dusty windows, casting warm beams across the room. It was the sort of place where things were rarely contentious, where everyone knew their role and followed the rules. Today, the room was quieter than usual. A handful of cases were scheduled, but none that seemed particularly pressing. That is, until Maria Jacobs walked in. Maria wasn't the typical defendant Carver was accustomed to seeing. Her appearance alone set her apart, tall, confident, dressed in a crisp, tailored suit. Her poise and self-assurance stood in stark contrast to the usual array of nervous defendants who shuffled into the courtroom, hoping for leniency. She had a calm, almost regal aura about her, the kind of presence that made everyone in the room take a second glance. She approached the stand without hesitation, the clicking of her heels on the hardwood floor echoing through the quiet courtroom. Carver, sitting high on his bench, looked down at her and gave a half-smile, offering a polite nod. His assumption was immediate. She was just another busy professional who had gotten caught up in a minor infraction. The kind of case he handled every day. "Ms. Jacobs," he began, his voice booming slightly in the otherwise still room. "I trust you're here to deal with a simple speeding violation." Maria looked at him with a calm, unflinching gaze. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady and confident. "But I ask for your understanding regarding the circumstances." Carver raised an eyebrow, sensing that she might be one of those who would challenge the fine. It wasn't uncommon for defendants to try to explain their way out of penalties. Most pleaded traffic-heavy schedules, emergencies, or vague reasons why they couldn't avoid speeding. But Maria's composure intrigued him. He could tell she wasn't here to beg for mercy. Without much interest in the specifics, Carver motioned for her to proceed. "Go ahead, Ms. Jacobs. What explanation do you have?" Maria paused for a moment, as if carefully choosing her words. "I was on my way to a critical meeting, Your Honor," she said, her tone professional but firm. "It's a matter of national security, and I didn't want to be late." The urgency of the situation took precedence. Carver's interest peaked for a moment. He frowned slightly, not entirely convinced. "National security, you say?" he repeated, eyeing her curiously. "Yes," she affirmed, her gaze never wavering. "And I understand the importance of traffic laws. I simply ask for leniency, given the circumstances." To Carver's surprise, there was no pleading, no desperation, just calm, collected confidence. Yet, despite her poised delivery, he couldn't help but feel her words lacked a certain authenticity. It was rare for people to be this composed in his courtroom. With a slight huff, Carver set aside his intrigue and made his decision. "While I understand your explanation, the law is the law. Ms. Jacobs, I find you guilty and issue a fine of $200 for speeding." He glanced down at the papers on his desk and, without a second thought, wrote down the penalty. Maria didn't flinch. She nodded politely, accepting the fine without protest. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice cool but respectful. As she turned and walked away, Carver couldn't shake the feeling that he had just interacted with someone far more significant than she had let on. Little did he know, Maria Jacobs wasn't just a regular citizen with an urgent meeting. She was at the forefront of one of the most important investigations in the country, and her quiet confidence hid a far more complex life than he could have ever imagined. As the days passed, Judge Carver couldn't stop thinking about Maria Jacobs. Something about her demeanor stayed with him. It wasn't just her calm composure in the face of a traffic fine. It was the sense that she wasn't the typical defendant he encountered. Most people, even those with legitimate reasons for speeding, were either apologetic or defensive, hoping to avoid the full weight of the law. But Maria, she had walked into that courtroom as if she were already in control of the situation, as if the rules of the courtroom were secondary to whatever was happening outside it. Carver's curiosity gnawed at him. Who was she, really? What kind of person just stood there, unbothered by a judge's decision, and walked away with nothing more than a polite thank you? His intrigue only deepened when he casually overheard a conversation in the courthouse a few days later. One of the clerks was talking about a woman named Maria Jacobs, leading a major federal cybercrime investigation. The clerk mentioned how Jacobs' work had been featured in national news outlets and how she had been involved in the takedown of several hacker groups that had breached top government systems. It was the kind of story that piqued Carver's attention, especially considering that the Maria Jacobs he remembered from the courtroom didn't seem like the type to be involved in such high-stakes, high-profile work. Later that evening, Carver went home and did what he rarely did. He Googled her name. The results were immediate and overwhelming. Maria Jacobs wasn't just a government employee. She was one of the leading experts in cybersecurity. A former top tech attorney, she had transitioned into the world of cybercrime after being recruited by the federal government. Her role as a digital forensics expert had made her a key player in cracking down on a series of international data breaches. In fact, Carver read about an investigation she was currently leading involving a notorious hacker group suspected of targeting several major financial institutions. The more Carver read, the more he found himself stunned. This was the same woman he had found in his courtroom. The woman who had barely said a word when he issued his penalty, yet carried herself with an air of quiet authority. The contrast between the woman in the courtroom and the woman described in these articles couldn't have been starker. But the more he reflected on it, the more Carver realized that perhaps he had misjudged her. Maria wasn't the kind of person to wear her accomplishments on her sleeve. She didn't seek attention or validation. Her work, however monumental, was something she kept quietly under wraps, possibly for her own reasons. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine court cases, but Carver found himself thinking more and more about Maria. What would it be like to sit down and speak with her, to learn more about her work, and perhaps to apologize for his assumptions that day in the courtroom? Maria Jacobs was living in two worlds, one that the public saw, and one that few ever would. To the outside world, she was just another government worker. But beneath that public facade, she was a powerhouse in the realm of cybersecurity, playing a pivotal role in investigations that affected national security. The woman who had been fined for speeding was the same woman responsible for taking down some of the most dangerous cybercriminals in the world. Her office was a sleek, modern space nestled in the heart of a government building. Inside, a team of analysts worked tirelessly, scanning data, identifying patterns, and tracking digital footprints. Maria's team was known for their meticulous attention to detail, a trait that had earned them a reputation for success. But Maria herself wasn't the kind of leader to hover over her team. She trusted them, gave them space to work, and empowered them to think creatively. Lately, though, her attention had been focused on a case that had begun to consume all of her time. A hacker group, known only by the codename Echo Syndicate, had been wreaking havoc on multiple high-profile organizations, from financial institutions to tech giants. The syndicate had managed to infiltrate some of the most secure systems in the world, siphoning sensitive data and causing chaos in its wake. Maria's team had been on the case for months, but it wasn't until a recent breakthrough in the digital forensics that they finally had a clear lead. The breakthrough had come from an unusual source, a string of encrypted messages that had been circulating among the hackers. After weeks of painstaking work, Maria's team had cracked the encryption. What they found shocked them. The Echo Syndicate was planning a massive data dump that could potentially compromise entire sectors of the U.S. economy. The stakes were higher than ever, and Maria knew they needed to act fast. Her days were spent in endless meetings, tracking the syndicate's every move, and coordinating with federal agencies to set up a counterattack. The pressure was immense, but Maria thrived in the chaos. She had seen it all before. The way cybercriminals could vanish into thin air, the endless hours spent tracing one lead after another. But this time, it felt different. The Echo Syndicate was smarter, more elusive, and their attacks were growing bolder. Maria knew the clock was ticking. She had to find the leader of the syndicate before they could execute their final plan. But there was something else that kept her up at night, a nagging feeling that someone, somewhere, was aware of her every move. It was as though the syndicate had anticipated her next steps. In the midst of all this, she kept a low profile. She avoided public appearances, preferring to work in the shadows, far from the spotlight. The work she did wasn't for recognition or fame. It was for something far more important: national security. And she was determined to finish what she'd started, no matter what it took. Maria's life had become a whirlwind of strategy meetings, encrypted communications, and high-stakes decisions, while the pressure of leading such a crucial investigation weighed heavily on her. She was in her element. The complexity of the Echo Syndicate's operations demanded all of her expertise, and Maria knew that every detail mattered. One missed lead, one overlooked clue, could send them down the wrong path and risk everything. The breakthrough she and her team had discovered, the decrypted messages from the hackers, had revealed crucial information about the syndicate's next move. It was a ticking time bomb. The group was preparing to release massive amounts of sensitive information to the public in a coordinated cyber attack that would wreak havoc on the country's financial systems. Maria couldn't afford to waste time. Her team had to move fast, but with extreme caution. The urgency of the investigation reached a fever pitch. Maria's team worked around the clock, tracking the syndicate's every move. They followed digital breadcrumbs. Every email, every IP address, every transaction. Each piece of the puzzle connected like a thread in a web that, if pulled too hard, could unravel everything. The team's progress was painstakingly slow, but Maria trusted them. She had assembled this team for their brilliance, each member a specialist in their field, and together they had cracked some of the most difficult cases in recent years. Maria wasn't just a leader. She was a force within the digital forensics world. Her ability to see patterns where others saw chaos was what set her apart. While most analysts spent hours sifting through data logs, Maria could identify key anomalies within minutes, connecting dots no one else could see. Her instinct had led the team to the syndicate's encrypted communications, and it was her sharp eye for detail that had uncovered the most recent lead. They now knew where the syndicate's next move would come from: a server hidden in an offshore location, disguised as a legitimate business. But the closer they got to the heart of the syndicate's operation, the more dangerous the situation became. The hackers had become aware that they were being hunted. Maria's team had intercepted a message hinting that the syndicate was planning to launch their attack much earlier than anticipated, catching them off guard. The team scrambled to track down the server's location, racing against time. As they delved deeper into the syndicate's digital footprint, Maria's mind never stopped calculating the risks. If they made one wrong move, the entire operation could implode. But failure wasn't an option. She couldn't afford to let the syndicate succeed. The future of the nation's security depended on their next steps. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, Maria remained calm. In the face of the impossible, she had learned to trust her instincts and the team she had built. They had worked through countless challenges, and they would overcome this one too. With every clue that fell into place, she felt herself inching closer to exposing the true leader of the Echo Syndicate. The clock was ticking, but Maria knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let the criminals win. Judge Carver had grown increasingly obsessed with the idea of Maria Jacobs. The more he thought about her, the more he found himself fascinated by the contrast between the woman he'd encountered in court and the one he was now reading about. How could someone so poised and collected in a courtroom be leading such a high-profile investigation into a dangerous hacker group? The disconnect was dizzying, and Carver couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had underestimated her in a way that felt deeply wrong. His curiosity about Maria only intensified when he heard about a major cybersecurity conference being held in the city. The event promised to feature some of the top minds in the field, and Carver, who had little to no knowledge of the digital world, saw this as an opportunity to learn more about the work Maria was involved in. In the back of his mind, he also hoped he might get a chance to speak with her, perhaps to apologize for his previous judgment. The day of the conference arrived, and Carver found himself surrounded by tech experts, federal agents, and corporate security leaders. He was out of his depth, but he didn't mind. The conference was buzzing with energy, and he couldn't help but be impressed by the intelligence of the people around him. He scanned the crowd, hoping for a glimpse of the woman whose work had so captivated his thoughts. And then there she was. Maria Jacobs stood on a stage, speaking confidently to a packed room. The crowd listened intently as she outlined the latest trends in cybercrime and the methods being used to track down sophisticated criminal organizations. Her voice was steady and assured, and there was an air of authority about her that was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just a participant in the conference, she was its centerpiece. Carver watched, riveted, as Maria laid out complex data about the Echo Syndicate, the very group he had heard about in the news. Her insights were sharp, and she explained the nuances of cyber forensics with such clarity that even a layman like Carver could understand the gravity of the situation. She didn't seek applause, and she didn't flaunt her accomplishments. Instead, she spoke with quiet determination, as if this was just another day at the office. When her presentation concluded, the audience gave a polite round of applause, but Carver didn't move. He stayed seated, his mind racing. Maria was more than just a leader in cybersecurity. She was a woman of conviction, one whose calm and calculated approach to the most high-stakes challenges was something he had sorely misjudged in that courtroom. As people began to file out of the auditorium, Carver saw his chance. He approached her cautiously, unsure of how to begin, but determined to make amends. "Ms. Jacobs," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. I wanted to speak with you for a moment. I'm Judge Thomas Carver. We met a few months ago in court." Maria turned to him, a small, measured smile tugging at her lips. "Judge Carver," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "I remember." Carver hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice sincere. "I misjudged you in that courtroom, and I wanted to acknowledge that. Your work is extraordinary." Maria paused, looking at him with a hint of curiosity in her eyes. She could have brushed him off, but instead she nodded. "Thank you, Judge Carver," she said, shaking his hand. It's not about what happens in a courtroom. It's about what we do with the time we have outside of it." The words hit Carver harder than he expected. It wasn't just an apology she had offered. It was a moment of clarity, a reminder that everyone carried their own story, and that appearances could be deceiving. As they parted ways, Carver realized that this encounter had fundamentally changed his perspective. He had learned something invaluable about Maria Jacobs that day, not just about her accomplishments, but about her character. And for the first time in a long while, he was forced to confront his own assumptions and prejudices. But that was just the beginning. Maria's fight was far from over, and Carver was beginning to understand that his involvement in her story was only about to take a much deeper turn. As the weeks passed, Carver's curiosity about Maria deepened. He found himself following news about her work, often catching snippets of reports on the Echo Syndicate investigation, and despite the growing complexity of her role in national security, his initial impressions of her as a composed, focused individual only seemed more accurate. He couldn't ignore the thought that perhaps their worlds, his as a judge and hers as a federal cybersecurity expert, were far closer than either of them realized. One day, out of nowhere, Carver received an unexpected call. It was Maria. "Judge Carver," her voice came through the line, clear and measured. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to reach out. There's something I think you might want to know." Carver was taken aback by the call, unsure of what she could want from him, but he listened intently as she explained. "We've made some headway with the Echo Syndicate," Maria began, her tone professional yet urgent. "But we've uncovered something troubling. A network of individuals, people in powerful positions, who may have been aiding the syndicate from the inside. We need your help, discreetly, of course." Some of these people may have connections in your circle. The mention of powerful insiders shocked Carver. He had suspected that the syndicate's reach was vast, but hearing that there might be people within the very structures he worked in was a jarring revelation. "I'm listening," Carver replied, his mind racing with the implications of her words. "What exactly do you need from me?" Maria's voice softened slightly. "We need a way to dig deeper without alerting them. We've traced some unusual financial transactions and a few key names that keep coming up in our investigations. You're in a unique position to help us verify some of this. Your expertise in handling sensitive matters, your connections. You have access to records and people that we can't approach without raising alarms. We need you to help us connect the dots." Carver felt a surge of conflict. He wasn't trained in cybersecurity, and he had always believed that his role was strictly to uphold the law within the confines of his courtroom. But this was different. The stakes were far higher now, and the chance to prevent a catastrophic event made the choice clearer than he could have imagined. "I can't promise anything, but I'll do what I can," he said, his resolve solidifying. Maria's relief was evident. "Thank you, Judge. This means more than you know." Carver agreed to meet with her in a secure location the following day. As he hung up the phone, a realization washed over him. This wasn't just a simple favor for a colleague or an unexpected collaboration. It was his involvement in something that could change everything. The quiet judge who had once dismissed Mariah in court was now stepping into a larger, darker world, one where he had a chance to make a real difference. The following afternoon, Carver met Mariah in a nondescript cafe on the edge of town. They sat in a corner booth, surrounded by the noise of clinking coffee cups and soft chatter. Mariah handed him a folder filled with papers, each detailing names, transactions, and dates that linked several high-profile individuals to the syndicate's activities. Carver's mind raced as he scanned the documents. There were connections here that he hadn't expected, and people he had known for years were now part of a much bigger puzzle than he had ever imagined. "This is bigger than I thought," Carver murmured, looking up from the folder. Mariah nodded, her expression serious. "And it's only going to get more complicated. We need to move quickly, but carefully." For the first time, Carver felt the weight of the responsibility. The courtroom had always been his domain, but now, alongside Mariah, he was entering an entirely new arena. An arena where the law wasn't always black and white, and where the consequences of failure were far greater than any verdict he had ever delivered. As he left the cafe, Carver couldn't shake the sense that his life had just taken a dramatic turn. His relationship with Mariah was no longer just about a simple traffic ticket. It was about stopping something far more dangerous. And this time, his role would require more than just the application of the law. It would require him to make decisions with global consequences. Carver's involvement in Mariah's investigation grew deeper with each passing day. What had started as an unexpected partnership, based on a moment of curiosity and a desire to make amends, was quickly turning into something far more complex. As he worked alongside Mariah and her team, he found himself pulled into the shadows of a world that was both exhilarating and terrifying. He'd never imagined himself working outside the confines of the law in the way he now was, connecting dots between high-profile individuals and a criminal syndicate that threatened national security. But it felt necessary. The weight of the responsibility was immense, and Carver knew that he could no longer ignore the path he was on. The people involved were powerful, with the kind of influence that could easily shut down any investigation if they sensed they were being watched. That made their every move more dangerous. Maria was always one step ahead, her calm demeanor never wavering even as the pressure mounted. Carver admired her ability to compartmentalize her emotions, but he could sense that even she was starting to feel the tension. There were sleepless nights, anxious conversations, and moments where they both had to remind themselves why they were risking everything. One evening, after another long day of reviewing data, Carver met Mariah at a quiet, out-of-the-way diner, a place they had chosen specifically for its anonymity. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Mariah looked weary, her eyes bloodshot from too many sleepless nights, but she carried herself with the same quiet strength that had drawn Carver in from the beginning. "There's something we're missing," Mariah said, her voice low, but urgent. "I've been going over the data again, and the patterns, they're wrong. It's not just a hacker group trying to cause chaos. They're after something more specific, but we don't know what yet." Carver leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "What are you suggesting? That it's not just about money or power?" Mariah nodded. "Exactly. There's a larger game at play. The syndicate is trying to destabilize more than just the financial systems. If we don't figure out their endgame, the consequences could be catastrophic." Carver could feel the gravity of her words settling on him. This wasn't just about protecting data. It was about safeguarding the stability of an entire nation. "What can we do to stop it?" "We're working on narrowing down their next move," Mariah replied, her fingers tapping the table nervously. "But we're running out of time. We've tracked their digital footprints to a secure location in Europe, but they've gone quiet for the last few days. I have a bad feeling about this." Carver's heart raced as he considered the implications. A few days of silence could mean they were moving toward the final phase of their operation. If the syndicate had gone underground, it was likely they were preparing to strike. The stakes had never been higher. "We need to act now," Carver said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "If we're going to stop this, we can't waste another minute." Mariah gave him a sharp look. "I'm glad you're on board, Judge. But this is a dangerous game we're playing. You'll have to be ready for whatever comes next." The weight of the situation was now entirely clear to Carver. The courtroom, once his domain, felt a world away. But as he looked into Mariah's eyes, he knew that there was no turning back. What they were about to do could change everything, not just for them, but for the entire nation. As they left the diner, the reality of their shared mission settled in. Mariah and Carver had crossed a line that neither of them could easily return from. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, and the outcome uncertain. But the only certainty now was that they were in this together, and they would face whatever came next, side by side. The following days blurred into a whirlwind of strategy meetings, urgent phone calls, and sleepless nights. Carver and Mariah, now fully entrenched in the investigation, had reached the critical phase. The Echo Syndicate, once an abstract threat in the digital shadows, was now an imminent danger. Their actions were no longer limited to hacking into financial systems. They had a far more devastating objective in mind, one that could disrupt the core of national security. Carver found himself in new territory. As a judge, he had always been in control, his decisions backed by legal precedent and the authority of the court. But here, in this murky world of covered operations, there were no clear rules. Every choice he made felt like stepping into the unknown, each decision a gamble with lives and the future of the country. Yet despite the uncertainty, he was resolute. He couldn't turn back now. Mariah was the anchor that kept him grounded. Her calm confidence and unshakable focus were a constant reminder of why they were doing this. She had devoted her life to protecting the public, to thwarting those who would use technology for malicious ends. She wasn't just a brilliant cybersecurity expert, she was a fighter. "We've tracked their final operation to a location in London," Mariah said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We believe they're planning to execute their attack in the next 48 hours. Carver nodded, his heart racing. The clock was ticking. He had already contacted several trusted law enforcement officials who would assist in the international operation, but Mariah had made it clear that this was a joint effort between them. Federal agencies, the judiciary, and trusted partners like Carver. There was no room for error. The plan was set. Carver would work on the legal side, ensuring that warrants were in place for any raids or arrests that might be needed. Mariah, along with her team, would continue to track the syndicate's digital trail, closing in on their location. They were operating on the razor's edge, knowing that any wrong move could alert the syndicate, causing them to pull back and disappear into the digital ether. The final hours were a blur of tension, briefings, and last-minute preparations. Carver's phone buzzed incessantly, each call more urgent than the last. Mariah remained calm, but Carver could see the strain in her eyes. They had both given everything to this moment, and failure was simply not an option. Finally, the day came. A joint task force, including top cybersecurity agents and law enforcement, raided the syndicate's hidden facility in London. Maria was the mastermind behind the operation, but Carver's legal guidance ensured that everything was handled by the book. They moved with precision, and by the end of the day, the core members of the Echo Syndicate were in custody. The following weeks were a blur of trials, investigations, and global cooperation to dismantle the syndicate's far-reaching influence. Mariah, her team, and Carver had successfully stopped an international cyber attack that could have devastated the global economy. As they sat together in the aftermath, Carver looked at Mariah, his respect for her deeper than ever before. They had come a long way from that courtroom encounter. What started as a simple traffic violation had led to a partnership that neither of them could have predicted. And for the first time in a long while, Carver understood what it meant to truly fight for something larger than himself. Maria's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need to. They had both done their part, and together, they had won.